Hey, it's Concrete, aka Rick. So today I have something a little interesting. I have new flavors from Flavorah. They're all pre-release right now. They're beta flavors, but I have permission to test them and talk about them. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. So there's going to be, I think, 28 total flavors coming out. I'm going to do them in blocks of 3. I've done tasting notes on these so far, so I'll be able to go a little bit more in depth than I usually do. But I will still be vaping them on camera because that's obviously what you came for. Um, Today I have root beer, I have their Blackberry Blossom, and I have their Morning Mimosa flavor. So a whole lot of alliteration today, if nothing else. So first, I have their root beer flavor. We'll go ahead and give it a shot here. I have it mixed up at about 4.5% right now, which I will talk about, but here it is at 4.5%. So right off the bat, what I'm getting is sort of the top notes from like a slightly fancier craft style root beer where you can actually kind of taste that it's not actually sassafras anymore, but that kind of sassafrasy kind of taste, that combination of like something darker and herbal, almost like a horehound or a like herbal licorice root with that kind of wintergreen coolness, and I'm getting a good amount of that, which is nice. It tastes very much. It's a little bit sharp. It isn't like a candy root beer barrel kind of flavor. There's some actual bite and spice to it. The actual mouthfeel on the vape is really interesting too. It has like a little bit of like a lighter effervescent kind of mouthfeel, and that flavor is really hard to capture in vaping. And so when somebody says effervescent, it's kind of leaning. It's sort of an interpretation of effervescence, but it does actually feel like a little bit light and sparkly. The finish on it's actually really interesting. The finish has kind of a creamy vanilla. I mean, creamy, but like not dairy vanilla to it, and that effervescence kind of carries through onto the finish. It actually has an effect a whole lot like the actual foam or head on root beer. So the top of this flavor is absolutely beautiful. I like that heavy spice note. I like the amount of carbonation. That foamy finish thing is really cool. Where I start to run into issues with it, it doesn't feel like there's too much of a base here, and that can be a problem with root beer flavors in general. They tend to be a little bit top heavy. This is a better spice note than the other root beers I've tried, but they do tend to be a little bit more spice forward, and you're sort of lacking for that kind of richer, fuller base that isn't just a candy like root beer barrel flavor. I feel like this is definitely kind of falling into some of the same trap. It's doing the top end well, but it's kind of not doing the base of the flavor too much justice. It also is a little bit weak for Flavorah. I was trying this and I was convinced my taste buds were just going out and I had like a case of Vapor's tongue, but then I started cranking the percentages. And it turns out I like this a lot more around like 5%, which is a lot for me for most flavoring companies. And that's kind of crazy for Flavorah. Generally, if you do something from Flavorah at 5%, you can expect to have a fairly bad time unless it's one of their tropical fruits or their blueberry muffin, and this definitely needs that extra kick to get going. It kind of works as an accent down low because it's so top heavy and it's just top notes, but in order to get sort of a full solo flavor experience out of it, I've had to crank it way up. I did mix a tester with like 3% Capella's root beer and this at 1.5%, and it was sort of bringing some of that foam and those top notes through. So I think it's pretty viable to use another cheaper root beer to kind of fill this out and then just use this in a relatively lower percentage, like 1.5 to maybe 2% as an accent flavor to kind of bring in those top notes. In terms of what to do with this, well, we talked a little bit about the root beer thing. Good take on root beer top notes. So I'm part of a testing group for these flavors, and this is the first one that they really dug into. So one of the first suggestions was to start adding vanilla to this, and that's a really good suggestion. So shout out to Jerry. But the sort of lack of base of this thing actually might make it a little bit more versatile when you're talking about adding vanillas and creams. What I really want to do with this is I really want to make it into a root beer float, because I feel like those top notes are going to come through really cleanly. You're going to get a good amount of root beer. There's that foaminess to help sort of lighten it up. But there's this big ice cream shaped hole down in the base that really is just sort of begging for something richer and heavier to kind of come in and fill it in. I think a root beer float would be an awesome application for that. For a root beer float, I'd probably use your vanilla bean ice cream of choice, or maybe like spin up the base from another vanilla ice cream recipe and kind of omit the higher, sharper top notes and just plug it in there. With this maybe up at like 3 or 4%. There's also some talk about using this with like cola or something to go ahead and fill in the base. Sort of bring in that kind of cola base, but the top note here should be strong enough to kind of like lay in over the top of it and still give you a distinct still give you a distinct root beer while you're being able to exploit some of the base from that. And with that cola base, you know, you could add some extra caramel, anything like that. Shout out to Koppel. He's apparently going to try to make a ginger ale out of it. So Godspeed, you beautiful, beautiful man. We'll see how well that works out. But yeah, it's a solid root beer top note. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it as your only root beer flavor unless you like your flavors a little bit sharper and a little bit more herbal. That just so happens that's kind of right up my alley, but I understand it's not necessarily universal vaping style, but I do really like the top notes here. I like the balance of spice and the mouthfeel. That sort of foamy, effervescent mouthfeel is actually really good. So, next on the list, we have Blackberry Blossom. This one scared me. I am not going to lie. If you've ever had Flavorah's Blackberry, you will know the exact kind of nightmare that I was envisioning. Flavorah's Blackberry. People tell me there's a blackberry flavor in there somewhere. I just taste perfume. Which, you know, is kind of an issue. I had a better experience with this than that. So I'm testing this at 1%. This one is more in line with what I'd consider like the Flavorah house strength. 1% will generally get you most of what you need from the more aggressive Flavorah flavors. It's an interesting flavor. So for the blossom part, instead of going for like a high floral perfume, it's more like a musk. It reminds me a lot of the floral note off of their honeybee flavor, which is kind of a like a wildflower. It kind of reminds me of like a wildflower note. It's not perfumey. It actually kind of legitimately does like a wildflower thing, and I get a lot of that here. The berry itself, it's a nice dark blackberry. It doesn't really go mixed berry for me. It doesn't taste too candied. It tastes like a fairly realistic blackberry. It is a little warm as a flavor, which seems, I mean, obviously it's warm, you're vaping it, but like if you've ever vaped TPA's blackberry, that is an extremely warm flavor. It seems like you're vaping it a whole lot warmer than whatever wattage you're actually running at. This isn't as pronounced, but I definitely get some of that warmth. The flavor here is actually pretty juicy too, which is nice, but it doesn't quite cross the line into that kind of like sticky jammy flavor for me. It tastes very juicy. As opposed to jammy, which is cool. I haven't seen that in a blackberry before. They're usually either way too floral or they're way too warm and jammy. This kind of splits the difference, and I'm liking what it's doing with that. I think overall that musk note kind of counterbalances some of that juicy sweetness. The sweetness feels and it might just be my brain telling me this should taste like honey because musk tastes so much like honeybee. But the sweetness here tastes a little bit darker than like a sugar sweetness. It definitely feels like a honey kind of sweetness. It kind of reminds me of eating a like very ripe, warm Himalayan blackberry, like right off the vine with like the actual flowers and stuff, like outside where you're getting some of that musk, and some of those floral notes off the actual like warm vegetation. The floral note here reminds me more of warm vegetation than anything else. And I say Himalayan blackberry because they're sort of bigger and sweeter and flatter in taste than like wild blackberries. So this doesn't have much in the way of like tartness. It's not like a tartar berry like a raspberry. It's a very sweet, flat, but still like pretty realistic berry flavor, along with that sort of like warm vegetation, wildflower musk note. I like it quite a bit. In terms of using it, I think that it will go really well with fruits. I don't think that musk is heavy enough to really detract from mixing it with other fruits. I think you could actually use this as like a pretty neutral sort of dark, sweet base layer for fruit mixes, and you could throw like your brighter fruits on top of that, and hopefully it should kind of sit in that base instead of like being nice and layered. I don't think the musk here is strong enough to really come into play when you're talking about other fruit flavors. Yeah, at least in a negative way. The one place that I would watch out, I'm not sure this is going to be the be-all, end-all blackberry for trying to pair with like creams or bakeries, because I could see that musky note getting a little bit weird. While I think it'll fit in the fruit, you don't really want musky butter. You don't want musky eggs. You know, musk is not a flavor you want associated with anything even vaguely dairy related. So I'd watch out for that one. It does remind me a lot of tea, and I think that will be a really good application for this flavor, is sort of using it with some of the tea concentrates for like a beverage vape. And I could see this working in cocktail vapes too, where you have some sort of herbal component like a gin or something that already has a lot going on. In those top notes, I think this should go ahead and like slide in pretty unobtrusively. I like it quite a bit. I feel like as you sort of crank up the percentage, that musk does kind of scale up, and if you start pushing up towards like 2-3%, that musk gets, there's no real delicate way to say this, so I apologize, but it kind of gets that cat pee thing that you get with some of the honeys, which is sort of a real problem. It's a good sign that you're mixing with too much of a heavy hand if you taste a mix with honey in it and all you can smell in the room is cat pee. This doesn't really do that up until about 2-3%, so that's a good reason to keep it a little bit lower. It's one of the less sort of ammonia smelling honeys that I've had, but it's still an issue to watch out for. And then the blackberry underneath, so it starts out very, very dark and very juicy, and sort of as you crank up the percentage, the first stop, it starts to add sort of like this fig character to it, which is why I think it'd be really interesting with tobaccos. I really enjoy Flavorah's fig, but it's maybe a little bit aggressive. In those top notes, it has the same kind of musk thing going on, but it's a lot more aggressive. This would actually work pretty well with tobaccos as long as you can go ahead and play around with the mix to keep the entire thing fairly dry, not really let that juiciness get in the way. But after you push past that fig, it starts to get a little bit raisiny, again up towards 2-3%. So I'd probably use this one around 1%. And then the final flavor for today, I have Morning Mimosa. So I will come out right and say, I feel like this is a pretty interesting flavor. You know, you've got to do a pretty good job to sort of accurately portray drinking before noon, and I feel like this reflects some of that. It is definitely an orange and champagne flavor. So sort of describing the way it vapes, right off the bat, it comes across a little weird. It kind of gives you a little bit of like an overripe orange flavor, um, like a fermented orange flavor, which is pretty recognizable if you've ever had like an orange that's been sitting around long enough that it actually goes moldy. Uh, you'll recognize that flavor. I feel like I'm making excuses for it, but in my personal experience, it actually goes away pretty quickly. It kind of separates, like you're getting like the oranges and the funky part from the champagne all at once in the front, and then you take a couple of vapes and it kind of calms down and it separates back out a little bit. Um, so obviously this is supposed to be orange juice in champagne. The orange note here, after it kind of calms down a bit off that initial rip, is actually pretty good. Um, Pretty mellow overall for an orange. It does feel a little bit juicy. It's like a very navel orange kind of taste. It's really nothing mind blowing, but it kind of works to bolster the champagne more than anything else. I feel like the champagne's definitely in the driver's seat with this one. The champagne is a little aggressive right off the bat. So it does have that kind of like funk to it. So if you're a connoisseur of fine cheap champagnes, it tastes a lot like a cooked champagne to me, where it's very front loaded and it's very aggressive. Has that like sort of like initial attack where you get a little bit of fermented, you get a little bit of like mineral, and then it kind of smooths out on the back end. And I'm definitely getting that from this concentrate. The fermented note, it doesn't taste yeasty, but it does definitely have that like kind of champagne funk to it. Um, it gets a little hard to work around. It's very prominent, and the actual champagne behind it actually has like a little bit of effervescence. It's nice and balanced, has just a little bit of sweetness, a little bit of sourness to it. It's good. A lot of using this concentrate is going to be figuring out how much of that sort of initial burst of funk that you can take. And what the ingredients around it are going to let you do. So testing this solo, I found that that funkiness gets a little bit too aggressive solo, right around 1%. So my solo mark for it was about 0.75%. But I felt like the base flavor could stand to come out a little bit more because I really like that base orange juice and champagne thing. So it's interesting. It's going to be interesting to mix with. I feel like the best application for this, I think that it's like distinctly mimosa enough that you could actually probably use it as like a bridge flavor when you're making a juice. So I think even a small percentage of this is going to like impart enough of a mimosa that you could hang another sort of less aggressive champagne flavor like TPA champagne off of one end of it, and then throw like some more orange, like Flavor Arts Royal Orange in there, which is a juicier orange, on the other, and then like rely on this to kind of tie it all together. Uh, you know, with that kind of funky aggressive note, I found that cooling also does a really good job of sort of taming like weird off notes and juices. So a little bit of like WS-23 or even Coolada would probably help clean that up a little bit. If you were using in that sort of mimosa application, I'd be tempted to start cranking this up to like 1.5% and then trying to see if I could make the like sort of fizzy fun base of this work with that top note. As you start to crank up the percentages much beyond 1%, it actually gets to the point where that top note almost takes on like a carrot skin kind of astringency, which is a little weird, little hard to get around. But I feel like the base of it's really solid, so it's just a little bit frustrating. But I'll definitely be playing around with that. It's interesting if nothing else, and I feel like it does the champagne and the orange juice part really well until you get to that top note, and that top note maybe is just a little bit too aggressive. But I don't have any specific details on when these are coming out, which, whatever. But these are going to make up sort of the slate of my new flavor testing for the next month. So I figured I'd go ahead and do videos on them as I went. So I hope this is helpful. When they come out, if you're looking at any of these, if these notes kind of help steer you in the direction that's the right direction, that's fantastic. But thank you for watching.